Well, I think we can get started now, and I'll say good evening and welcome to this colloquium presented by the MPC Great Books Program. I'm David Clemens, the Great Books Program Coordinator. Our colloquium is made possible by the extraordinary generosity of the Apgar Foundation. I also want to thank the Monterey County Weekly for its support, and I want to recognize the indispensable contributions of Rich Monterey, Jeanette Haxton, Michelle Brock, Rosa Arroyo, and the MPC Humanities Division. And I also want to thank Aaron Burke and Alexis Pagano, who are working the door for us. I'm also happy to announce that I have arranged for a talk on December 9th by Zachary Mason, the author of The Lost Books of the Odyssey, which the Times Literary Supplement calls, quote, perhaps the most revelatory and brilliant prose encounter with Homer since James Joyce. That sounds like high praise to me. It is most intriguing that Zach is not a classics scholar, but rather a computer theorist with special interest in artificial intelligence. Our first colloquium last semester concerned great books and democracy, with Robert Pinsky, Victor Davis Hanson, and Dana Gioia. I have a few DVDs of those talks if anyone would like copies. They're on the back table in the back of the room. Tonight we begin a discussion of imaginative freedom and political freedom. As you no doubt know, last Friday's speaker, Mark Edmondson, was forced to reschedule due to the sudden severe illness of his mother. When that date is set, I will produce publicity, and if you leave your email address, I will personally notify you. I've got a legal tablet back on that back table as well, so if you want to be notified, just let me know. If you bought a ticket already, it will be honored, and you may also have a refund if you choose. The series concludes November 18th with Mark Bauerlein, former research director of the National Endowment for the Arts, teacher, essayist, blogger, and author of The Dumbest Generation. Tonight, we're extremely fortunate to have the renowned scholar, author, and translator Claire Cavanagh. Dr. Cavanagh is Director of Undergraduate Studies, Slavic Languages and Literatures at Northwestern University, specializing in modern Russian, Polish, and Anglo-American poetry. Her essays and translations have appeared in the TLS, the New York Times Book Review, the New Republic, the New Yorker, the New York Review of Books. If a journal has the word new in the title, she has been in it. Book Forum, Partisan Review, Common Knowledge Poetry, Literary Imagination, and other periodicals. Professor Cavanagh is also an associate editor of the Princeton Encyclopedia of Poetry and Poetics and is currently working on an authorized biography of Nobel laureate Czesław Miłosz. Claire has also produced major translations of the poetry of Miłosz and her fellow Nobel laureate Wisława Szymborska. Her translation of Szymborska's just released poetry collection, Here, is for sale. Here, right in the back of the room from the bookstore. Last year, Yale University Press published Claire's book, Lyric Poetry and Modern Politics, which Edward Hirsch calls, quote, scrupulously researched, convincingly argued, and wide-ranging comparative study of modern poetry and politics. Cavanagh writes from the West, but continually turns to modern Russian and Polish poets as the touchstones for her complex polemic and moving defense of poetry. The Times Literary Supplement simply calls it important and enthralling. The few copies we could obtain are for sale in the back. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the important and enthralling Claire Cavanagh.
Well, now I have to try and be important and enthralling. I mean, what a build-up. Anyhow, if I fail to enthrall you, please just at least look enthralled so that we don't let down David here. And I was very impressed you pronounced all the Polish L's right. You've been practicing. Well, lyric poetry and modern politics, the context in which we're living and working, Sounds like a total contradiction. And we're used to thinking in American society of lyric poetry as something that's way off at the margins, that's not central to anybody's lived experience. I'm in a funny kind of bifurcated position. That's how I happened to end up writing that book, in fact, because I work on these cultures, Russian and Polish, that I'll be talking about a little bit today. I'll be talking about two poets in particular, Szymborska, who you see really, really happily smoking up here, and Anna Akhmatova, a great Russian poet. Cultures in which poetry is intensely important and sometimes even too important. What Akhmatova's friend, the poet Osip Mandelstam, who died in 1938 in a Stalinist camp, said is nowhere do they value poetry as much as they do in Russia. It's only here that they actually kill the poets. Well, there are advantages to being in cultures that don't value poetry quite as much. But in fact, it was true. He came from a culture in which poets were killed, suppressed, repressed, in which poets' words come back, as in the case of Czesław Miłosz. He couldn't be published for decades after he broke his ties with the People's Republic of Poland after World War II. Finally, during the Solidarity era, they bring him back, and his words get inscribed on a monument to workers killed by the state. The words of their great romantic poets were taken up as slogans during the workers' movement. Workers would have different, some of them would be the Mickiewicz fans, and some of them would be the Słowacki fans. It's a different world. It's a world in which knowing the poetry and knowing the tradition is part of your self-definition. Nobody cares if a politician doesn't recite Whitman. In fact, if he started reciting Whitman or she, you could just see the polls just going down like that. There, if you don't know the poets, you're not a real Pole. You're not a true Russian. It's crucial to their self-definition, and the states have both respected and violated that trust. Poets are a little too important for the rulers of regimes both in the 19th and in the 20th century. So I'll be talking about that a little bit now. But I want to start with a poem, actually, that ended up having of a surprising amount of, not quite. You have 3 different screens. This is where our attempt to compensate for the giants playing tonight is you get so much media stuff going on here. If I put a poem up, you can all scream and yell. I was in a bar last night. I know what it looks like. So just pretend like somebody scored a home run instead of you're looking at a poem. This poem actually appeared in the back flap of the New Yorker magazine, the first issue that came out after September 11th, and it was written by a great contemporary poet, Polish poet Adam Zagajewski. It wasn't written for September 11th. It had nothing to do with September 11th, but the editor of the New Yorker was sitting in her apartment in Lower Manhattan watching what happened, and afterwards her first thought was, I have to find a poem that'll work, and she found this poem. I'm going to read it here for a minute, and then I'm going to talk about how this poem kind of encapsulates some of the paradoxes about poetry and politics that I'll be pointing to as we go along here. It's called Try to Praise the Mutilated World. Try to praise the mutilated world. Remember June's long days and wild strawberries, drops of wine, the dew. The nettles that methodically overgrow the abandoned homesteads of exiles. You must praise the mutilated world. You watched the stylish yachts and ships. One of them had a long trip ahead of it, while salty oblivion awaited others. You've seen the refugees heading nowhere. You've heard the executioners sing joyfully. You should praise the mutilated world. Remember the moments when we were together in a white room and the curtain fluttered. Return in thought to the concert where music flared. You gathered acorns in the park in autumn, and leaves eddied over the earth's scars. Praise the mutilated world, and the gray feather a thrush lost, and the gentle light that strays and vanishes and returns. Well, according to Alice Quinn, who was the poetry editor at the New Yorker, this ended up on refrigerators all over Manhattan and other places as well. It's by far the most famous poem I ever translated, and it's certainly Adam's most famous poem. But why on earth would it have ended up being the poem that ends up on the back jacket there and ends up on refrigerators in a stricken New York? Well, one of the reasons, I'll be pointing to this a little bit as we go along, is even though there's not a word in here about Poland, there's a rich history of poetry being used to compensate for virtually centuries of oppression and of seeing the world turned over and over and over again, the world turned upside down over and over again in a way that we can barely imagine in the States, where we have these nice big oceans to keep us safe from invasions, or so it seemed until September 11th. I mean, it had been since, I think, the War of 1812, since the continental United States had been invaded. There's some of that in there, but that doesn't quite work out either. We have little hints of history in here. You've seen the refugees heading nowhere. You've heard the executioners sing joyfully. You have all the stuff about the mutilated world, so there's something about history and about suffering built into that, where the world is mutilated both physically. We all know it, we just kind of don't register it, that the world we see has been scarred over and over again, both by natural and unnatural disasters, and also through its inhabitants. You have abandoned homesteads of exiles. Why did they leave? Where did we go? They go. We don't know. Salty oblivion, ship sinking. So there's little tiny hints, but in a lot of ways, what this poem does, I'm going to put this up here for a second. I'm not going to go through all my little definitions and things, but I just wanted to put up some traditional definitions of the lyric. It seems to fit the absolutely most traditional definitions of the lyric there are out there. And these are definitions like the ones you have here, where it's dedicated, as Webster says, to a poet's personal emotion or sentiment rather than external events, so that somehow the lyric poem is interior, it's private, it's personal, it's set against the outside world, it's not expressing the outside world. That's a very standard definition. These are classic definitions. John Stuart Mill says, eloquence is heard, poetry is overheard. And why is it overheard? This is Eliot's thing. The poet speaks to himself or to nobody. Private speech directed towards one's inner world, articulating one's inner world, it's nothing to do with history. It's nothing to do with the outside world. I'm going to skip the Bakhtin one, I guess, because the way Bakhtin writes, he's an important Russian theorist, is almost impossible to read, even in Russian. But it says that the poet is alone in the universe. It creates the illusion of the poet being alone in the universe. There's no one else, nothing else there. So standard definitions say the lyric is absolutely private. And this is one of the reasons why I always feel so puzzled dealing, as I do, with cultures in which the lyric plays a very public role, in which lyric poems, this is one odd example. I gave Miłosz's poem being put on the monument to the fallen workers. Another example is the most popular romantic comedy in the Soviet Union. There is such a thing as romantic comedy, or there was in the Soviet Union. When I was an undergraduate in Leningrad, had songs by, it was as though the soundtrack had been written by Emily Dickinson. They had this difficult Russian woman poet, and they'd set her songs to music. Everybody knew them. Everybody was going around singing her songs. You know, they're singing Tsvetaeva songs. No, Tsvetaeva is, like, she makes Emily Dickinson look like a walk in the park. She's impossibly difficult, but everybody knew these songs. So the definitions don't quite fit to me, but at the same time, you look back at Zagaevsky's poem, and you see that there are ways in which these traditional definitions of lyric do work. Who is he talking to in here? At first I thought maybe this poem is so popular because everybody's thinking he's really talking to us. But he's really talking to himself, I think. The poet is saying, what's the poet's job? It's to praise the world, praise the mutilated world. He's encouraging himself to take on the job that is the job of the poet. And it's a really hard job, because look how many times he tells himself to do this. Try to praise, you must praise, you should praise, praise. It's hard. Why is it hard? Because of the abandoned homesteads, and because of the refugees, and because of the executioners, and because the earth is mutilated over and over and over again throughout human history. So he's talking to himself, but he's talking to himself about how hard it is to be a poet because the world resists poetry. And then what does he tell you should do, or tell himself, and we're kind of eavesdropping or listening in or participating in the poem. He says, remember the moments when you were alone with someone you love. We were together in a white room and the curtain fluttered. Remember strawberries. Remember June's long days. Well, these are all the classic things. What could be more classically poetic than the idea of June and wine? And the dew was actually a mistake. We won't go into things that the translator accidentally added to the poem. Forget you heard it. But the strawberries, the wine, remember the room where we were alone, remember the concert where music flared, remember gathering acorns. It's all very traditional lyric activities. What he's doing, I think, is suggesting why we need lyricism. You need a private inner world to compensate for an outer world that fights your inner world at every moment, that resists having the inner world. And if you think back to September 11th, there was a sheet that was running all the time in the New York Times. I was kind of obsessed with it for days and days afterwards, where they took every one of the victims. We didn't know how many there were at first. They were saying 5,000, then they said 3,000. I think the final count, if there ever is a final count, was 2,900 and something. They did little profiles in the New York Times of every single one of those names, saying who that person was, or trying to. And some of them were incredibly boring people who collected shoes and had Pekingese. Some of them were these noble volunteer fire people who'd taken in foster children. But it was recreating the inner world so that they weren't just the ciphers. And he's telling you to hang on to that inner world in here. I think that's why the poem spoke. And I think it's why, in the Polish context, where they've used it to compensate for the rigors and the harshness of history for centuries, he knew in this poem how hard it is to preserve and how much the poet needs to encourage himself and to encourage us. So anyhow, these definitions of lyric poetry, I won't get into all of this now, these very traditional definitions have been picked up in recent years. This is another thing that agitated me personally. We don't have to get into all of it now. Have been picked up in recent years by a large group of critics. There's this strong movement within the Academy against lyric poetry. And why should it be against lyric poetry? Well, again, I'm not going to go through all the quotes, but I'll put up some of the quotes here. I was collecting them because this is my line of work. The top group of critics, let me get this down where I can, is a group of critics, or I just picked out kind of selective things, are a group mainly called the New Historicists that are kind of, their orientation is basically kind of Marxist. Lyric poetry is bourgeois. Okay, why is lyric poetry bourgeois? Because it represents the individual subject with an interior private life of his or her own that can never be entirely shared. Well, that's claiming you have an inner self, you have a private self. It's celebrating individuality or exploring individuality, personality, and privacy. All of these critics end up, Nicholas Rowe isn't one of them, he's just summarizing them, say it's the most fundamental of bourgeois. It tries to erase history, to celebrate individual autonomy at the expense of history, outside history. It's escapist. History is displaced, arrested, repressed, obscured, and it converts public into private property. So you claim the private world as your own world. You claim that you're holding on to your own world in the private self. Well, why did this give me pause? Not just because the traditions themselves, the traditions I work with challenge that and defy that, and I'll go on to this when we start talking about our next poet here, Akhmatova, but because I'd heard it all before. Working in the Soviet culture immediately after the revolution, and then in Poland, let's see, I think I cut off a couple of quotes here, yeah. Nope, even more. Yeah, here we go. Oh, well, you're never going to get them all on one page, but we can live with it. Down here is from the very beginning, you have a state that takes poetry's ideological dangers extremely seriously. It's amazing now to think of revolutionary leaders. Leon Trotsky, who I quote here, was the founder and the head of the Red Army. You'd think somebody founding a revolutionary Red Army would not have time to do extensive discussions of lyric poetry, but they took it incredibly seriously because it was wrong. Why is it wrong? Our epic is not lyric, he says. You can't have revolutionary poetry done for little lyric sonnet makers. We start getting the answer down here. Nikolai Bukharin, powerful political figure. He was killed by Stalin, but they all were. But he was really up at the charge. In 1934, they're establishing state policy on poetry. The speech he gave there was actually a collective speech. A bunch of people sat down in a room behind the scenes, trying to decide what kind of poetry was and wasn't not acceptable in the new state. 1934, they're laying down the law, and he says, communist individualism is a contradiction in terms. We can't have individualism. We can't have private poetry in the new state. We need a new lyric to give experience to the socialist man coming into being. And then down here, you see similar things coming up again when the Soviet regime goes over to People's Poland in the aftermath of World War II. Capitalist society creates the false division that makes personal lyric possible. The individual I was irrelevant, and so forth. They took it really seriously. The poets stopped writing around 1925. And I'm going to turn over here to the next poet we have on our handout to talk a little bit really specifically about the fate of one great poet and what happened with her poetry. And this is the poet Anna Akhmatova, whose dates are 1989. 1989, yes. Akhmatova has just learned to drive a car. 1889 to 1966. Beautiful woman. She was apparently about 6 feet tall, very thin. If she weren't such a great poet, I would dislike her intensely. Black hair, green eyes. Everybody was in love with her. She was a cultural icon very early on. Everybody was painting her. She was a celebrity, basically. There's a famous Cubist painting of Akhmatova. Here's one a little bit later. And I'll show you a picture from near the end of her life in a minute. So what happens with Akhmatova? This is sheet number 2. Akhmatova starts writing these intense, tight, beautifully crafted little lyrics about what everybody assumes is her love life. But of course, she's got an imagination. She's making it up as well. But she's exploring kind of the inner experience of a woman in love from an entirely new perspective in the Russian tradition. And I picked up one little tiny poem here to illustrate what she could do in sort of maximal amount of experience in tiny, tiny little poem. And I'll just read the translation. That the Russian is better, but we can't do all of it. He loved 3 things in life. Evensong, that's Vespers, the church songs in the evening, white peacocks, and old maps of America. He hated it when children cried. He hated tea with raspberry jam and women's hysterics, and I was his wife. In the Russian, there are little tiny rhymes all the way through up until the very end. The wife stands alone. So there are these little tiny rhymes. None of the rhymes quite work out. Sveti, Deti, Pavlinov, Malina, Ameriki, Isteriki. That's the best one, America and hysterics. And the wife stands alone. So she's even using the form to talk about it. Well, what's she doing here? She's really nailing the poor guy. But she's got him paired into 2 little sets of 3. The 3 things he loves, Vespers, white peacocks, and old maps of America. Exotic and useless, basically. You can't imagine these being combined with daily life. It's not even good enough to like regular peacocks. He has to like albino peacocks. This is a guy who really goes for esoterica. And old maps of America that won't actually get you anywhere, So you find a nice 18th century map that you can't get to any gas station on the planet from. What does he hate? He hates when children cry. He hates tea with raspberry jam. This is how Russians drink their tea. They put jam in it. And women's hysterics. And women's hysterics, we recognize, or some of us recognize the voice already. This is the guy telling you what you sound like when you're being extremely reasonable at a high volume. Women's hysterics, and I was his wife. So she condenses it down to 3 positive images, what he loves, 3 negative images, and then summarizes the marriage. It's I was his wife. She no longer is. She actually was still married at the time of this. You wonder what the poor husband, who was also a poet, writing his own poetic answers back, made of it. But she's using her imagination to create the portrait of a marriage here. Well, why on earth should a poem like this be politically controversial? I gave you these little definitions, a little private personal lyric. You'd kind of think these little tiny things about somebody's intimate love life or somebody's imagined intimate love life would be about as harmless as they come. But no. After the revolution, Akhmatova, who was enormously popular, there were postcards with Akhmatova on them. Everybody was guessing. What I always, thank God for classic rock, I always tell my students, it's kind of like there was this old Carly Simon song that was big when I was an undergraduate up the street at Santa Cruz, or down the street, whatever, up, I guess. You're so vain, you probably think this song is about you. That was sort of like Akhmatova. Everybody was saying, is it Mick Jagger, is it Warren Beatty, was she in love with the Tsar? Was she having an affair with this poet? What was going on with her love life? She was enormously popular. The revolution didn't like that. She was a woman. She was from the upper middle class. And she wrote private, personal expressions of interior experience. She became the whipping boy. Her poetry, again, you can't imagine it in the States. She was the subject of so many attacks in the 1920s. Her poetry is a ridiculous, pointless, and Pathetic anachronism. That was one attack. She writes about life from the boudoir to the croquet, what do you call it? The croquet field and back again. That's the subject. There's nothing in her about the work, nothing in her about collective. Attack after attack after attack. After 1925, she ceased to publish at all. But she wrote one poem that I'm going to look at here briefly called Lot's Wife, that's written between 1922 and 1924. It's right after the Revolution and right after the Civil War, which ends in 1921. She's still being allowed to publish, and she does this powerful poem. We'll look at a counterpart poem in a minute here, that takes the one line that is the fate of Lot's wife from the book of Genesis. If you remember the story, God says, if you can find the righteous ones in Sodom, I'll spare any righteous ones in Sodom, but the only righteous one is Lot and his wife, and they're told not to look back. And they escape from Sodom before it's destroyed, and then there's this one enigmatic sentence. She looked back from behind him and became a pillar of salt. Now, I could never figure that out. Who decides that the appropriate punishment is you get turned into a condiment? I mean, it just doesn't, make any sense at all. So she turns around and she's turned into a pillar of salt. But that's the only explanation. There's no, she's not given a name. She's not given any history. Akhmatova turns this little line into a poem that was allowed to be published because it's kind of disguised, but that's really about preserving the private inner world of the past, everything she was being attacked for, in the face of a new state that's forward-looking, collective-oriented, pushing towards the future, and for a while, even the word history was banned from Soviet school books. The past is over. We're on the forefront of the glorious new communist future. She listens here in the poem, but anguish spoke loudly to his wife, it's not too late, you can still gaze. So anguish, it's not sin, it's not the devil, it's not the evil one, it's anguish. She's losing her past. She's in this new world order. Akhmatova is thinking about what it's like to lose everything you've loved, everything that was you. At the red squares, at the red towers, it's not a good translation. It also means the beautiful towers in Russian, of your native Sodom, at the square where you sang, at the courtyard where you spun, at the empty windows of the tall house where you bore children to your beloved husband. Well, what does Sodom, which is a synonym for, basically going to Las Vegas in the old days before it was cleaned up, Sodom, everything evil, everything wrong you can do, suddenly it becomes someone's household life, someone's intimate domestic life, where she sang, where she spun, where she had children, and Lot isn't Lot anymore. He's the beloved husband. So of course she looks back. She looks back to preserve the past, and she feels. She glanced, and paralyzed by deadly pain, her eyes no longer saw anything. Suddenly you have a motivation. The salt I still don't follow, but she's paralyzed not because of God's will, but because of pain. She's abandoning the past. And what Akhmatova says at the bottom is that she is going to turn back, the speaker in the poem is going to turn back to commemorate the woman who turned back. That's the job of the lyric poet. My heart will never forget the one who gave her life for a single glance. So she's making really a powerful statement about the function of lyric poetry. It's where one individual person remembers another individual person, remembering their own beloved past, no matter what the consequences are. And Akhmatova knew the consequences all too well. That's what I'm going to turn to in the next poem, and felt them, in the Russian expression, on her own skin all too strongly. 1921, her first husband, Nikolai Gumilyov, another poet, is shot for counter-revolutionary activities. In the beginning of the 30s, under Stalin, the persecutions start building up and up and up. They don't want to touch Akhmatova. She's a woman. She's a little bit too popular. Unfortunately for them, even the working women liked Akhmatova's poetry. She was immensely popular among working women's poetry, and they were supposed to be reading something else, becoming a different kind of being, not reading Akhmatova. They didn't want to go after her directly. The state didn't want to go after her directly. What do? They go after her family, that thing that she talks about commemorating in the poem of Lot's wife, the space where you bore your children. That's what they go after. Her son is imprisoned for the better part of 20 years. Her third husband dies in a Stalinist camp. What's her response to this? Well, they're trying to silence her. They're saying, basically, your son fate depends on your silence. And she refuses to be silenced. How does she refuse to be silenced? She writes poems that cannot be published. She has a small group of friends whom she trusts, who memorize these poems and write them down. She hides her own copies, and there's a ritual that one of her dear friends commemorates in her journals. She says they read the poems, they read them over and over again until they've got them memorized, and then she takes the match, she lights it, she burns it. And she says that's the ritual. The recitation, the match, the hands, the ashtray, and the ashes. So this is part of what this little poem I gave you here, the sentence, is part of what happens during that sequence. It's from her great sequence of poems from 1935 to 1940 called Requiem. So mourning, a mass for mourning, they're about her son. She's commemorating her son, but she's doing more than that. And the torture of the woman who's behind waiting, she's doing more than that. She's turning her own suffering into the mirror of the suffering of all the women who've lost husbands and brothers and fathers and sons to the persecutions, the mass arrests and the terror of Stalinist Russia. She's turned her own suffering into a mirror for all of those people, even though the work cannot be published. Well, in fact, there's one strategic switch here, and you have the poem here. I'll put it up here as well and show you what it looked like. She was able to get this poem published in 1939. It's part of the sequence Requiem. It's about the imprisonment of her son, commemorating, as I said, the sufferings of all the other women in Soviet Russia at the time. She publishes it like this. She takes off the sentence, the title of the poem, and she takes off the date. Why does she have to take off the date? Because it's during Stalin's great purges, and that would be a dead giveaway. I think she dates it back to 1934, and she's able to publish it, and the whole poem gets transformed. Because what does it turn into now? They're still attacking her. Take off that title, take off the bottom. It's what they said Akhmatova was always doing, whining about her unhappy love affairs. So we can publish that. Somebody writes a little commentary in the publishing and said, Akhmatova is a relic of the old bourgeois family. Akhmatova, she's still suffering over things. We kind of value her. She's connected to the Russian past. And the stone word fell on my still living breast. Today I have so much. Never mind, I was ready. I will manage somehow. I have so much to do. I must kill memory once and for all. I must turn my soul to stone. I must learn to live again. Unless, she says, summer's ardent rustling is like a festival outside my window. For a long time I've foreseen this brilliant day, this deserted house. Well, if you take off the title, it looks like she's the way that the Soviets read it, the critics, and they were officially authorized state-sponsored critics. The only reason you could publish Akhmatova is permission had been given from above. She's been dumped again. Akhmatova's whining. The stone word is the lover rejecting her on her living breast. I have so much to do. I have to learn to live again after my husband or my lover has left me. And for a long time, I've foreseen this brilliant day. So she's able to publish it because they say it's a private little bourgeois lyric about poor little Akhmatova's unhappy love affairs. In fact, what the poem is doing to anybody who's going to know from the underground things, the stone word is the sentence that sentences her son to jail. And she never knows when he's going to get out again. As I said, it was almost 20 years. He was released briefly and then sent right back in. The stone word is the word of the state. It's the word of Stalin. I'm ready. I will manage somehow. Then what you get in the next stanza is this horrific little to-do list. This is the list you put on your refrigerator door to remind you what you're going to do today. Dry cleaners, half a dozen eggs, pick up a gallon of milk. But what does hers say? I have so much to do. I must kill memory once and for all. Well, in the poem Lot's Wife, you already see what memory means. Memory is how you preserve the individual world and pass it down from one to the next. She remembers this imagined version of Lot's wife, and somebody else may remember her. Turn my soul to stone, destroying the inner world. That's the way you survive in the brave new world that she's inhabiting now, the world of Stalin's terror. I must learn to live again. So the brilliant day and the deserted house. So here we have the deserted house as opposed to the house where she spun, Lot's wife spun, the house where she bore her beloved children to her beloved husband. So it's about killing the inner world, but that's not what actually happened. She went on to write the sequence, And the sequence, again, now there's a public monument outside the prison where she stood waiting for news of her son that has some of her words from this poem engraved on it. And I'll just give you one last picture of Akhmatova from 1959, when she'd only been published, had a few poems published in decades, and still is managing to preserve this poetic tradition and the tradition of lyric individuality under horrific oppression. Well, I'm going to move over now to Szymborska, a very different case. Why is Szymborska's code different? Well, her dates are different, for one thing. She's born in 1923, and she's still doing just great. She just came out with this most recent book here, or in our translation anyhow. She came out with the book a couple years ago. She's a different generation and a different world. She lived through World War II in Poland as a high school and then college student. Under the Nazi rule, Poles were not allowed to attend either high school or college because they were destined to be workers, slaves for the new state. They didn't need anything beyond basic reading and writing. When she finally went back to college after World War II, she switched majors I don't know how many times, and I'm not sure she ever finished her BA. She couldn't decide on the one thing that she was interested in enough to follow through to the end. I think she might have. I may be exaggerating, but it took her a while. But the other thing that happened with her that makes her really, really different from Akhmatova is she's basically a college kid when the war ends. That's about the right age. She's just the age you would be when finishing up college. She needs something to believe in. She's seen the world turned upside down, as I said. She's seen her country overrun by the Nazis. She's seen horrors she can only imagine. It seems like the previous regimes, the democracies of the interwar period, have been completely bankrupted. We had democracies, and what did they do? They didn't protect Poland, they didn't keep Nazism from rising, and they didn't prevent the devastation of her country. So she becomes a true believer in the communist state. And she writes really, really unbelievably bad poetry, celebrating the new state. And I have some, let's see, she had a poem. Let me see if I can find you the exact pages here. Yeah, so she's a true believer. She's a young woman who's an absolute believer in the state and believes in the kind of collective, progressive, future-oriented poetry that everybody's saying she ought to write. She writes a poem that really, really gets attacked in a newspaper because it's too unclear. It uses too many metaphors, too many images. It makes too many demands. So she writes a little prose explanation of the poem. The full burden of labor rested on the shoulders of the proletariat bent by oppression, but the fruits of that labor served to satisfy the property-owning classes and not the needs of entire nations. A must-read. So this is the kind of poetry you're supposed to be writing. Absolutely collectivized, nothing specific, nothing individual, nothing personal, nothing private. And the titles of the poems she was writing at the time are things like, What a Soviet Soldier Said to Polish Children on the Days of Liberation, Our Worker Speaks Out on the Imperialists, can't imagine what he said. An old working woman reminisces over the cradle of the people's Constitution. Yes, we know how those old ladies love to, reminisce about the Constitution. You hear it all the time. Go to a bus stop, hear about the Constitution. Same old, same old. This is what she's writing. Absolutely predictable stuff. And people in Poland haven't forgiven her to this day. There are a lot of people who still, once a communist, always a communist. But what happens to her is something really, Akhmatova was never a believer. Akhmatova mistrusted the regime from the start, and rightly so. I mean, she saw her first husband killed in 1921. She was never part of the state. Szymborska says that maybe it wasn't such a bad thing, that she was a true believer, that she knew about that, the mindset, this collectivist mindset that she was being asked to repeat and perform in her poetry. She says, if it weren't for the sadness, the sense of guilt, I might not even regret the experience of those years. Without it, I wouldn't know what belief in the one true cause really is, and how easy it is not to know what you don't want to know, and what mental gymnastics you're capable of when confronted with other worldviews. And what she says elsewhere, so she means once you know the truth, and it's the truth that's predicted into the future, the whole purpose of Soviet Marxist philosophy is to say we can predict how the future will unfold, not how it should or how it could, how it will unfold, this collectivist future, the triumph of the proletariat. She says, often a theory and ideology that promises to classify and explain everything instead sets up a barrier between the world and our notions of progress. So you cease to see the world. Well, what this means is she's going to do something completely different when she gets to her poetry than Akhmatova. It's exploring individual points of view. It's celebrating individual points of view. But what she says is even settling into what one individual point of view should or could or ought to be is putting on blinders. So she explores individual viewpoint after individual viewpoint after individual viewpoint. And I'll tell you just briefly, we can take a look at a couple of these poems. Then we'll go over to Herlot's wife and see what she does that's different than Akhmatova. I gave you the joy of writing here. I won't go through all of this. But I think it's a wonderful refutation of some of these theories that say, or these notions of the lyric that says the lyric exists in a little world by itself. It's, as you've seen in the ones I put up here, few little words on a blank sheet divorced from history, just a little individual viewpoint pretending it's all by itself in the world. She does something radically different. I'll give you a picture here of Szymborska. You had her smoking. This is what she does in her spare time for fun. Can you see it up there? When she travels around, she gets her picture taken under interesting place signs, and she loves herself with the Neanderthal especially. She went to the German town of Neanderthal. She also has one with Corleone because she loves the Godfather movies, and one in Ireland for Limerick because she's fanatical about obscene limericks. I was at her house at a dinner party when she made one up about Clinton and Monica Lewinsky. The main rhyme was ovalny and oralny, oval and oral. I won't even go any further. We'll just stop right there. Anyhow, I'm just going to put up, there's a wonderful artist, Jenny Holzer, who projects Szymborska's poetry onto buildings all over the world. This is in Chicago. And this is from The Joy of Writing. I won't read the whole poem. We don't have time. But what she does in The Joy of Writing is she say, of course we don't create a little private personal world that's entirely unbounded from history. She says what we do is we use our imaginations to pretend we can stop time for a moment. What's here in the poem isn't life. Other laws, black on white, obtain. The twinkling of an eye will take as long as I say, and will, if I wish, divide into tiny eternities, full of bullets stopped in mid-flight. Does she really think that a poem can stop bullets? Does she really think No, of course she knows. She knows all too well that a poem has never stopped a bullet, but we can imagine a world in which the bullets don't fly, or imagine a world in which the bullets don't hit. So it's a defense of the freedom of imagination, as the topic of the session would be here. And this is just one other poem that you have here on the handout. Let's see if this turns out properly here. I just wanted to mention, because this is one that she did in her first turn away from communism, in the first collection that came out after it. It's another defense of humanity. I'd never thought of this. Another Polish poet told me how they read it in Poland at the time, in the late 50s, after Stalin's death, and the partial debunking of Stalinism. I would never have guessed this. She's talking to someone, a being that's beyond being human, a yeti, an abominable snowman, imagining a trip, a non-existent Himalayan expedition. She loves the fact that language allows you to exist. I taught Russian grammar for years and years, and the definition of the conditional would have, could have, should have is counter to reality. She loves that language. She says the human speech's best achievement is the conditional, that we can go counter to reality in language. So that's what she's imagining here. And telling Yeti about all the reasons to come down and be human. We've got Wednesday bread and alphabets. We've got all these arbitrary, odd little things that don't fit into any large theory, into any big picture. 2 times 2 is 4. Roses are red there, down here, and violets are blue. Not every sentence means death. You'll see how we give birth among the ruins. We have hope. We have solitaire, we have Shakespeare, we have violins, we turn lights on. So the trivial and the sublime mixed up together in the mess that is actual human life. Up here it's neither moon nor earth, tears freeze. Oh, Yeti, semi-moon man, turn back, think again. Well, I thought this poem was entirely apolitical, that it was a defense of the complexity and the mess and the charm of everyday human existence. I was talking about it in front of Zagajewski, in fact, who wrote the first poem there, and he said back when this poem came out, this was saying, forget your lofty systems, forget the worldview that allows you to stand above the messy, indefinable chaos of ordinary human existence and categorize everything to the true believers, as she'd been, come back down to the regular human, charming, horrible mess that we all inhabit. What does that mess look like when she turns to Lot's wife? I had more I wanted to do. I always have more I want to do, but maybe we can finish with this so that we'll have some time for questions. So look what she does with Lot's wife, which is so radically different from Szymborska. I'm afraid it doesn't all show up properly. Enough of it. You've got it on your handout. You'll figure it out. Her Lot's wife does something completely different. Akhmatova has these tiny, compressed little quatrains recreating the motivations for Lot's wife. She turned back out of anguish, the inner world that causes that anguish, the inner world, the private life that she's losing, and then the pain of loss, followed by the final quatrain in which the speaker, the poet, turns back to commemorate that loss. Szymborska's Lot's wife is a mess. They say I looked back out of curiosity, but I could have had other reasons. I looked back mourning my silver bowl, carelessly while tying my sandal strap, so that I wouldn't have to keep staring at the righteous nape of my husband Lot's neck. From the sudden conviction that if I dropped dead, he wouldn't so much as hesitate. From the disobedience of the meek, checking for pursuers, struck by silence, hoping God had changed his mind. Our 2 daughters were already vanishing over the hilltop. I felt age within me, distance, the futility of wandering, torpor. I looked back, setting my bundle down. I looked back, not knowing where to set my foot. Serpents appeared on my path, spiders, field mice, baby vultures. They were neither good nor evil now. Every living thing was simply creeping or hopping along in the mass panic. I looked back in desolation, in shame because we had stolen away, wanting to cry out to go home, or only when a sudden gust of wind unbound my hair and lifted up my robe. It seemed to me that they were watching from the walls of Sodom and bursting into thunderous laughter again and again. I looked back in anger to savor their terrible fate. I looked back for all the reasons given above. I looked back involuntarily. It was only a rock that turned underfoot, growling at me. It was a sudden crack that stopped me in my tracks. A hamster on its hind paws tottered on the edge. It was then we both glanced back. No, I ran on. I crept. I flew upward until darkness fell from the heavens, and with it scorching gravel and dead birds. I couldn't breathe and spun round and around. Anyone who saw me must have thought I was dancing. It's not inconceivable that my eyes were open. It's possible I fell facing the city. Well, what you get here is mess. I mean, it's a very controlled mess. It's a great poem, but it's mess. Why did she turn back? She doesn't know. You can go through, and I did go through and count at one point. I think there are 22 or 23 different reasons she gives for turning back here, and they don't add up. How can you turn back hoping God had changed his mind and turn back because a hamster startles you on the edge? Who notices a hamster when the city is falling? In fact, what is a hamster doing there? I have no idea. She turns back because all the animals are fleeing now. Serpents, spiders, field mice, baby vultures, everything, all the living creatures escaping the city. She suddenly shifts our perspective. It's not just about human lives being destroyed. When a city is being destroyed, all the animals run. It's like the rats escaping the ship. So it's not simply human experience at stake here. There's only one mention of God. There's a lot of stuff that sounds like natural disaster, a sudden crack. Is it an earthquake? We don't know. Is it God? We don't know. Did she turn back because she's sick of her husband? She says so for 1 minute, but then she says from checking for pursuers. So there it would be a rational cause. She gives a million reasons that don't add up. Why does she do this? Well, one thing that's going on in here, I think, is she doesn't talk about Polish experience or Eastern European experience or the experience of the war or anything, very rarely directly in the poems. But what I see when I look at this poem, or one thing I see, again, political context and historical context, is Warsaw was razed pretty much to the ground in 1944 after the Warsaw Uprising. And I've seen this extraordinary documentary footage where you have 250,000 residents marching out sort of in single or double or triple file, after the Nazi conquest of the city, after the Polish underground army had risen up. She's seen, or she knows what it looks like when a city is destroyed and how people leave, and it's a mess. It's not you turn back because you miss the house or the home. You turn back for a million reasons that you yourself can identify. And we all see it every day on the news. You know, that the tsunami has hit, the floods have hit, the earthquake has hit yet another city, the mudslides have taken over, the war, the war in Bosnia or whatever. We've seen this a million times, the chaotic exodus from the city, everybody running away. So there's a modern sense of historical experience and political experience embedded in the poem as well. There's also the sense that individual beings are chaos. She has another poem that I think is called May 17th, 1976 or something like that, where she says, I know I existed because I was still around on May 18th, but I can't remember a damn thing I did. Our inner worlds are mysteries even to us. That's why we have, what are we up to now, about 14,000 varieties of therapy? There's no one clue, there's no one magic key to unlock the inner world. It's a mystery to you, even trying to reassemble your motives for why you decided to get your coffee at Starbucks and not at your normal. I was driving by the street that day, and I remember that they had this kind of mug that I always wanted. Figuring out your motives for anything is virtually impossible, and that's what she's doing here, is recreating the impossibility of doing justice to the inner life. She's also giving it a funny modern twist here. They say I look back out of curiosity. Well, who's they? Lot's wife died whatever century, whenever the book of Genesis taking place. I don't know. Who are they talking about? She's talking about all the people. This Lot's wife has an incredible sense of hindsight. All the people who must have speculated about her motivations ever since, and she's answering them back as well. So there's another complication. Chaos of leaving the city. You can't ever plumb the depths of your own inner life. And other people always get it wrong. It wasn't curiosity. Look at how many other things it might have been. Then she also gives us a hint about the modern world as well. If you look down, I look back for all the reasons given above. It's not inconceivable that my eyes were open. It's possible. Well, that's the language of bureaucraties. I look back for all the reasons given above. That's what you do when you're checking a box. I look back for A, I was savoring the downfall of my enemies. B, I didn't want to look at Lot's wife, at Lot's neck anymore. C, there was a hamster on my path. D, all of the above. She's challenging us a bit in this poem, too. She takes her experience of being this true believer. There's one reason for everything, and we progress triumphantly into the future. And telling us to decode as well, telling us to go to complexity of an inner world that can never be exhausted by one set of reasons alone, and pointing to that little A, B, C, D as a way of reminding everyone. There was another poem we don't have time to talk about called Writing a Resume, where she talks about how we amputate ourselves and strategically program ourselves in order to get the resume out for that particular job that we want, because whatever it was, I was born to be a computer programmer. This is what I have shaped my entire life around, every piece of work experience, those years at McDonald's, all towards the computer programmer. You create this artificial narrative of your life and plow forward. She's saying, look back and unpeel, and you never get to the bottom. So the lyric for Akhmatova becomes a way of exploring the very idea of self. We all think we know who ourselves are. She says unpeel. She has a poem about the onion where she says the reason why onions are so sublime is you peel back and they look exactly the same. Whereas we have all these weird innards mixing up in all different kinds of ways. That's what being human is for Akhmatova, is never being able to peel back to the core. And I'll just finish now, since I want to leave time for questions, with the last poem on the sheet. Since I started with 9/11, I'm going to end with 9/11 and the Szymborska poem, photograph from September 9/11 that you have here. And see what she does here with a political and social tragedy that's beyond any adequate expression in any form. What she did is she'd seen a photograph. In Europe, they're not as polite about the photographs they'll use as they are in the States. Somebody had a zoom lens and caught people throwing themselves out of the building so that you could see their faces. It wasn't published here, but it was published in Europe, and she saw that. And she turned it into this poem about what, I mentioned her joy of writing, about what the limits and the possibilities in a way of lyric poetry are vis-a-vis human tragedy. They jumped from the burning floors, 1, 2, a few more, higher, lower. The photograph halted them in life and now keeps them above the earth, toward the earth. Each is still complete with a particular face and blood well hidden. There's enough time for hair to come loose, for keys and coins to fall from pockets. They're still within the air's reach, within the compass of places that have just now opened. I can do only 2 things for them: describe this flight and not add a last line. Well, what can a lyric poem do? Nothing. We know the end of the story. I think it's a remarkably brave poem anyhow. I can't even bear to think about this. And she not only bore it, she tried to figure out what can she do here. She can do nothing. Of course, they're going to fall. They've already fallen. You can never resurrect those people who have fallen. But what she can do is take the one moment. All these critics talk about the lyric stopping time, pretending to be outside of history, pretending to be a world unto itself. She's not pretending anything. We all know the end of the story. But what she can do is take one moment when they're still in free fall and they're still individuals and they still have hair and keys and coins, all the trivia, all the detritus that make us what we are, with a particular face, and hold them there just for a moment. They're still within the air's reach, within the compass of places that have just now opened. She can hold them in possibility for one more moment. And that's what the lyric poem can do. It doesn't stop time, it doesn't stop bullets, but it preserves individual lives and individual freedom. In here, there's still a tiny moment of freedom within the compasses of places that have just now opened, of which we all know the final conclusion. The final end is always there, but you can preserve that one moment of free flight in a lyric poem. And I'm happy to take questions, comments. Yes, please.
At the end of your speech, you reminded me of, when you spoke of peeling the onion, you reminded me of another politically minded author, poet, and artist, Germany's Günter Grass, and his memoir, Peeling the Onion. And at the beginning of your talk, you spoke about poets who are too politically involved. Would you care to comment, because you never actually got to that, how in America our poets are really not involved in politics, and how in Europe, and especially, post-World War II Germany, Günter Grass was really considered the moral conscience of the people, and then it kind of came to a bitter end in his lifetime.
Well, the question, I've been asked to paraphrase questions, so I will hear. The question is about poets who are too politically involved, American poets not being politically involved, and on the example of Günter Grass as well. That's not really what I was trying to say. I couldn't elaborate everything in here. It's not that American poets aren't politically involved. There are a lot of American poets who are intensely concerned with political events. The difference has been, and as I said, it's been both a blessing and a curse, that in Poland and Russia, it's part of the tradition to take that seriously. Whitman was enormously politically involved, but no one was reading him in his lifetime. It's only after he died that he became, sort of this bar. We don't have this tradition of listening to the poets and taking the words seriously, arguing about them. And it doesn't always mean that Polish readers or Russian readers read better than we do. They don't. There's a whole tradition of how you read the poems, that there's an enshrined way, just the same way we all know 7 years ago, you don't stop to think about it anymore. You've just got it down. You know that that's, Gettysburg Address. But the fact is that their writings become politically controversial, or they're used to express sentiments that the people themselves can't express under an oppressed regime in the way that Akhmatova did. They're used to embody the nation in a way that's just not part of the American tradition, for better or for worse. So it's really, poets could be taken too seriously politically in Poland. They didn't want to bury Czesław Miłosz's body in a Catholic cemetery, there were 2 weeks of protests from the radical right because he'd been involved with the Communist Party as a younger man, and because they didn't think he was a good enough Polish patriot. And it was only a telegram from the Pope that said he was on the right track. Give the guy a break. Let him get buried in the Paulinus crypt. That's, I think, taking the political side of poetry a little too seriously. Just bury the guy already, you know. But that's what I mean about taking it too seriously, is there's an intense investment in the poets and the poetry that can distort both the poets' lives themselves and the poetry. Is that kind of, okay. Are there other, yeah.
I don't necessarily expect that you'll have this answer, but I'll ask since we're discussing it. How seriously should we take poetry as a political entity in this country?
Well, one thing is it doesn't really make any difference what I say anyhow. One thing I've learned from being a professor for many years is you can say whatever you think about what people should do with poetry, and it's not going to... But I think what's important, there are a couple of things. One thing I really miss, and this is where I hold our educational system partly responsible, is we don't see poetry as part of a continuum with the rest of our experience. We all got brought up on The Cat in the Hat, or most of us, or read it to someone more times than we ever even want to think about. Well, that's poetry. You know, there's been studies done about how he used, trochaic dimeter. He knows exactly what he's doing. It's like an extended haiku. He had a list of how many words he was allowed to use. He turned it into a narrative. Everybody knows it. And when I was trying to quote hop on pop to somebody, just one of those things. And I quoted it wrong. I said, stop, don't hop on pop. And it just drove me crazy because I knew I had the rhythm wrong. We have that stuff ingrained. It's stop, you must not hop on pop. Otherwise, it doesn't scan. But who knows from scanning? We just have it embedded in us. We have popular songs from way back when. I mean, the American treasury of popular songs. It's a continuum with poetry. Madison Avenue, rhyme and meter. Winston tastes good like a cigarette show. I never smoked a Winston in my life. I'm a child of the era when they still put them on TV. We know it because it scans, or I know it because it scans. A lot of you are just be happy. You never saw the Winston commercial. Change you can believe in. It scans, and you hit on the right words. You can fit. We know all these patterns and meters and so forth. We have them embedded in us. If you hear somebody blasting rap in the boombox, you get that. You know the beat right away. It's not part of our cultural heritage to make the leap from those things into this incredible treasury we have in English of lyric poetry. So that's one thing I think should be taken more seriously. And poetry as a political statement sometimes can fall absolutely flat and sometimes resonates better than anything else. And I just wish we were more aware of it. Another 9/11, I was really tracking stuff after 9/11 because first there was Zagajewski's poem, and then there's a wonderful association in Chicago, the Great Books Foundation. What they did was they printed poems in the Chicago Tribune a few weeks in advance. The first they had a poem that came out right after September 11th, and they had meetings in libraries and sort of public spaces across Chicago where members of the Great Book Foundation would go and discuss the poems with people, and they got a huge turnout, and they continued doing it for a couple of more years. They didn't pick poems that were written about September 11th. There was a W.H. Auden poem, and then there was a Szymborska poem, and there was a Miłosz poem. Again, the Polish poets, I think somehow this tradition of defeat and loss and war and so forth resonates even when they're not writing about it. And people really needed that stuff. I mean, there were these big turnouts for the poetry discussions. I think if it were built into our culture more, my kid doesn't read poetry in school. I mean, he'd rather die than read poetry anyhow. His mother, as he says, Mom goes to work and talks about poetry. Like, cooties. But it's not built into our educational system where you just memorize things and learn them and know them and they resonate with you. I mean, all of you probably have one or two poems at least that you know all or part, and they come back to it, or hymns that you know from church that come back to it strategic moments. We're not sort of educated to see that as part of the continuum between our private lives, popular culture, everyday life, and high culture. And in fact, that's our bridge. Rhymed and metered language. English is fantastic for that. You know, the Great American Songbook, Ella Fitzgerald, it's phenomenal. We're not trained to see that as part of a whole spectrum of highly organized language that meditates on private and public experience. And I think that's a huge loss. That's kind of it. I don't think poetry should necessarily be a political statement on one position or another, although there have been intensely successful poems, wonderful poems, written about political events. But that's not all we're missing. Other questions? Or yeah, please.
I had a question about translating poetry. Excuse me if I massacre this poet's name. Zbigniew.
That was just
good?
right.
Okay.
Yeah, good for you. Yeah.
Has a poem on translating poetry. And I can't remember exactly how it goes, but the end of it is a bee comes out of a flower with his nose yellow.
He's got pollen on his nose, yeah.
And I've been working on translating some Guivi's poems from the French because I don't like any of the other translations. But, you know, as you were going through the Russian, you know, there's all these internal sounds and things going on. And what do you choose when you translate? What do you go for? The main thing, the meaning, the sound?
My friend who I translate with, Stanisław Baranczak, developed a theory after translating for years and years and years because he had to teach a class, and so he needed a theory of translating to justify how he'd been doing it. And what he called it was the semantic dominant, but that was just invented, is whatever carries the most meaning. He just wanted to make it sound official, what he'd been doing. But I don't ever have, there's not one thing you can identify. I think what he meant is you feel your way into a particular poem and try and figure out what you can't lose. Because you're going to lose something no matter what. I wrote an article on it once called The Art of Losing, because you realize you gave up this beautiful little rhyme, or there was this fabulous pun that you were never going to get. And sometimes there's there was one poem that Szymborska wrote for the last collection that I spent about a week on one stanza and then just kind of gave up because it was so... She loves limerick, she loves puns, she loves jokes. And the puns were all about walking through a forest, and every pun was a forest pun. So I just couldn't figure out that many. One of them was Gothic Niebotic. That's what I remember, which is Gothic and skyscraper, which don't rhyme in English. But she was talking about the shapes of pine trees, which are like Gothic cathedrals, and they're skyscrapers. It's perfect. I just gave up. And then I wrote and said, I'm sorry, I just can't do this one. And she said, it's all right, it's impossible. You know, so, okay. I got it from the authorities. She has a Nobel Prize, she knows. But you try and compensate. Like there's a little wordplay here or a little, sound patterning there, and you try and squeeze something in with Adam's poem, Try to Praise the Mutilated World. I didn't even know while I was doing it. When you're in it, you're just trying to figure out, okay, how do I get to this line and what sounds right? And then afterwards I realized I had lots of A sounds in it because he has beautiful sound patterning. Praise the mutilated world, June's long days, like little rhyme internal. I wasn't thinking about it at the time. You just feel like, oh, this word kind of feels right here. You're just trying to compensate for all the things you lose and realizing some of them you'll never get. And try and make it seem inevitable. Like when you shake the poem, it won't rattle. There are no loose parts. Everything fits. So that even if you lost things, whoever's reading the translation won't pick up on it if you're lucky. That's about as systematic as I can get. Any other? Yeah, in the back.
As far as Russian poetry currently, is there a political reaction to the sort of return of sort of a semi-authoritarianism in Putin and the current regime there? Is there any kind of re-energizing of political poetry in Russia currently as a response to what's going on right now?
Okay, the question is about whether there's a resurgence of political poetry in Russia under the new authoritarianism that's developed under Putin. And it's a really good question, and I wish I had a really good answer for you. I think one of the things that one of the things that's striking in both Russia and Poland, Poland has a quite stable democracy, after that horrible air crash where the leader puts all the leaders in one horrible old plane and they crash. The country stayed stable. They have a stable democracy. They didn't have an economic downturn. They're doing okay. Russia is I hate to say it, a new kind of disaster area. It's like that poor country just lurches from one sort of disaster to another. But I know that the strongest impulse after the fall was that we don't have to do politics anymore. Let's play around. Let's have poetry that actually plays around. In Poland, one of the reactions was, it's funny because there are lots of American and English language poets who just worship the Russians and the Poles, these great poets who produced this masterful stuff and suffered for it, and their poems are read by hundreds of thousands and so forth. What's happened with a lot of recent Polish poetry, and I think this is true of some Russians as well, they started reading American poets. Frank O'Hara was, if anybody knows Frank O'Hara, enormously popular in Poland, where he called his poems, I did this, I did that poems. I went down to the store, I bought some milk, I did this, I did that. Casual little poems about everyday experience, poems about Raymond Chandler. I was really shocked at that, about film noir and American movies and American pop culture. So that, and postmodern sort of playing around, whether with all the repressions that have continued and are accelerating in Russia, there's been a kind of backlash. I'm going to ask around. It'll be too late to give you a good answer, but I'm curious about that now that you raise it myself. And there was one other question over here. Yes, please.
Yeah, you said, and I'm paraphrasing, that we haven't been educated to appreciate poetry or see it as part of a continuum of all those other things that you mentioned. I'm just wondering if you think that, at least for those of us here that are younger, maybe under 30 or so, if growing up in an environment of electronic media where images are supplied to us, we don't have to imagine them, in some way diminishes our imaginative capacity and our ability to appreciate or get everything out of poetry that there is to be gotten out of.
That's a huge question, and that's the kind of thing Mark Bauerlein, who's coming here, is really concerned about, is what having multiple screens with multiple messages coming at you all the time does, not focusing and not concentrating. And again, it's something my husband and I are really aware of, because we have a 16-year-old who's been doing computers since the age of 3, and now it's always baseball plus economics on the screen, baseball plus French, baseball plus something else, the scores versus the game that's going. There's always multiple things going on at the same time. How it affects the reading of poetry, I'm very curious, because the other thing I've noticed since I teach poetry now is the web is sensational for poetry. You can Google any writer and find tons of poems. I have uploaded all sorts of YouTubes for the class I'm doing now. I have an introduction to lyric poetry, because you can find song versions of all sorts of things. And there are also songs that have really, really good lyrics that function as lyric poems that the students haven't been thinking about. And in my experience, too, the students are obsessed with song lyrics. Trying to find out song lyrics is something. There are websites. I had a brief moment where I knew a few hits, where my son wasn't embarrassed to be, seen with me at concerts, and he still can't drive. So I was driving to concerts, and I took him to Coldplay, and I listened to Coldplay concert music, and I went online because the Cemeteries of London from Viva la Vida is a classic ballad, and I was teaching ballads. I thought, this is great. This has all the ballad features. It goes back with oral tradition, and I think the web in some ways has kind of like an oral tradition function. People write poems down from memory or write lyrics from memory, and they undergo sort of mutations and stuff. They get transmitted along sort of informally. And I went on it. I couldn't figure out the words, and I found out like 9 million teenagers also couldn't figure out the words, and there's like a million variations of people adding on, trying to get the words to the cemeteries of London online. So I think in a way, again, I feel like if we can make this kind of crucial link up, poetry is actually really good for people who use, this is a definition of lyric poetry I really like from the critic Angus Fletcher. He says, large issues focused on small screens. And I thought about it even here, is you look how small and compact these things are. We're all trained to read abbreviated language on small screens now. I have never tweeted, and I still don't know how to send an SMS. I just haven't done that yet. But everybody's decoding little tiny words on small screens all the time. If you can start thinking of poetry as it's another dense, trying to compact complicated messages into very few words that can show up on a little screen, I think there's all sorts of stuff already in there to just plug that into. It's just not kind of done yet. I think it's easier in a way than a novel because you've got the short thing here. You can look at it. You can come back to it later. You can look at it in a different context. You know, you're not going to do that with War and Peace. Oh, yeah, I'll skim 1,300 pages and then come back to it later. I don't think so. I think that's it.